In this lecture, we will continue our discussion on anterior pituitary hormones, analogues and inhibitors. Specifically, we would be discussing gonadotropins, the agonists. So the specific agents that we would be looking at would be Folliculogetropin, Folliculogetropin alpha, Gonadotropins. We would also be looking at human chorionic gonadotropin, which is abbreviated HCG. Because the lecture is kind of integrated, in addition to these drugs, we would also be considering the pharmacology of estrogens, progesterones, progesterone, and we'll be also looking at oral contraceptives. But during the course of this lecture, these are the drugs that we would be discussing. We would also be looking at the male side of things. We would be looking at androgens and anabolic steroids as well. So this is the goal for our lecture today. So what are gonadotropins? Let's consider the first question. What are gonadotropins? So if we look at this word, we can divide it into gonad and tropin. Okay. So gonad refers to the reproductive cells. Okay, so what are the reproductive cells in the males? It is the testis. And in females, it is the ovaries. So these cells give rise to the gametes. Okay, so what's the male gamete called? The male gamete is called sperm, and the female gamete is ovum. So, what are gonadotropins? The definition is gonadotropins are hormones released from the anterior pituitary. So this is the hypothalamus, and this represents the anterior pituitary. Okay, so gonadotropins are hormones. Okay, let's write it down here. Hormones released from the anterior pituitary in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone secreted by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus. Okay, so they are hormones released from the anterior pituitary in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone secreted by the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus secretes gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so this is abbreviated like this, and that acts on the anterior pituitary, which results in the release of FSH and LH. Okay. So these are the gonadotropins. So what are the gonadotropins? What are gonadotropins we have discussed, and examples would be FSH and LH. Okay. Okay. So let's reiterate again. So hormones, so the gonadotropins are hormones released from the anterior pituitary in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone secreted by the hypothalamus. And they are two, FSH and LH. Okay, but so when we say gonadotropins, we mean FSH and LH, and also human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay, human chorionic gonadotropin. If you would have noticed, it doesn't fit into the definition, right? So we said, what are the gonadotropins? We said gonadotropins are hormones released from the anterior pituitary in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone secreted by the hypothalamus, and we have found that to be FSH and LH. But here we have written also human chorionic gonadotropin. The reason being, this human chorionic gonadotropin is produced by the placenta, and it's called the gonadotropin because its function is almost identical to LH. Okay? Yeah. But HCG is not same as LH. Okay, HCG has got a different sequence. It's got different sequence and carbohydrate content. With respect to LH. It's got a different sequence and carbohydrate content when we compare HCG with LH. But the function is almost identical to LH. Okay. Since the function is almost identical to LH, this is called a gonadotropin. But strictly speaking, as per definition, it doesn't follow the definition, but it helps to remember this. So when we say gonadotropins, we mean FSH, LH, and HCG. Okay, so in our lecture, we will be covering these three. And now you know why we are covering these three. Yeah? Let us recap what we discussed thus far. We said that we have the hypothalamus, so the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone. This GnRH acts on the anterior pituitary. And the anterior pituitary in response releases LH and FSH. These LH and FSH act on the gonads. What are the gonads? In the females, it's the ovary. In the males, it is the testis. Okay. So if we look at this figure, we have got these three organs. Yeah. Now, these three structures, let's write it down here. We have got the hypothalamus. We have got the hypothalamus acting on the pituitary, and we have the pituitary acting on the gonads. So this we call the hypothalamo-pituitary-gonadal axis. So what does the hypothalamo-pituitary-gonadal axis do? The hypothalamo-pituitary-gonadal axis does two things. It controls the growth and development of the gametes. Which are the gametes? Right. In the male, it is the sperm, and in in the female it is the ovum. Okay, so it controls the growth and development of the gametes. The second thing that this axis does is it controls the release of sex steroids. Okay, so which are the sex steroids that we are talking about? We are talking about estrogen, we are talking about progesterone, and which is the male sex steroid? The testosterone. Okay. Right. So what are the gonads? The gonads are organs that produce gametes. And what are the gametes? In males it is the sperm, and in females it's the ovum. Okay. All right. So we have got this hypothalamo-pituitary-gonadal axis. When that is activated, what happens? It ends up controlling two things. One is the growth and development of the gametes, and second is the release of sex steroids. Now, why? Because the gonads have two functions. One, it has got a reproductive function. Okay, the second function of the gonads is they act as endocrine glands. They have got an endocrine function. Okay, so what is the endocrine function of the gonads? It is to release the sex steroids. Which sex steroids? Estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. Okay, so gonads have got two functions. And because gonads have got two functions, the role of the hypothalamo-pituitary-gonadal axis is one, to control the growth and development of the gametes, and secondly, to release these sex steroids. Our lecture is on the gonadotropins. So to do that, to discuss more about the gonadotropins, we will split the scheme into two. Okay, we will look at the gonadotropins acting on the female gonad first, and then we will look at the gonadotropins acting on the male gonad. Okay, so to learn this, we need to look at the female reproductive system. Okay, and this part of it we will be discussing this aspect when we cover the male reproductive system. Okay. So what is our goal in this lecture? We're going to look at gonadotropin release, gonadotropins. Okay, we are going to look at the pharmacology of gonadotropins. So to do that, we will study the reproductive systems individually. Okay, and then we will give ourselves the grand big picture. The female reproductive system, in conjunction with the male reproductive system, ensures the continuity of the human species. Okay. So the female reproductive system plus the male reproductive system ensures the continuity of the human species, meaning if the reproductive system is not there, then our species might not survive. Okay. So that is the importance of the reproductive system. The reproductive system, which is made up of the female and the male reproductive system, ensures the continuity of our species. Okay. So from an evolutionary standpoint, if we don't have the reproductive system, then our species would be at a big disadvantage. Okay. So now we are going to consider the female reproductive system. So what are the functions? Let's look at the functions of the female reproductive system. Of the female reproductive system. Okay. So let's write this functions using again a mind map. Okay, that helps us to organize our thoughts. So let's say functions of the female reproductive system. Okay, so let's look at the functions one by one. Okay, so the main function would be to produce the gamete. So what is the gamete? Ova. So what is the process by which ova is produced in the body? What's the technical term for it? Yes, it's oogenesis. Okay, so the first function would be oogenesis. Okay, so oogenesis itself is the formation of ova, okay, which is the female gamete. Okay, this ova itself is the female gamete. Okay, the second function is, we said, oogenesis takes place in the female gonad. Which is the female gonad? Ovary. Okay. So this gonad has got two functions. One is to produce the gamete. The second is to produce the sex hormones. So that would be the second function. Okay. Production of the female sex hormone. Okay, let's extend this here. Production of the female sex hormones. Okay, so which are the female sex hormones that we are talking about? Which hormones? Right, so the female hormone, sex hormones that we are talking about here is, very well done, it is estrogen and progesterone. Okay, so what would be the next function? The next function would be the female reproductive system. We said it works in conjunction with the male reproductive system. So it should be able to receive the sperm. reception of sperm. Okay. Then what should it do? It receives the sperm. The next aspect would be to reach the sperm near the ova. Okay. So transport the sperm to the, or let's say enable transport, okay, because sperms are motile. Okay, so the genital tract, female genital tract enables the transport of the sperm to the ova, okay, to the ova at common site, say. Okay, which is the common site? Usually it is the ampulla region of the fallopian tube. Okay, we'll come back to that. Hold on that thought for a moment. Okay. Okay, the next function would be, okay, so we generated the ova, then we produced sex hormones, then we received the sperm, we took the sperm to the ova, so obviously fertilization takes place. So after that, what happens? There is pregnancy. Okay, so after pregnancy, what happens? The release of the conceptors, okay, the mature conceptors outside the body, and that is called, yes, parturition. Okay, so that's how the act of the baby coming out is called parturition. Okay, so after the baby comes out, then what should the reproductive system do? It should be able to nourish the baby. Till now it was nourishing within the body. Now it has to nourish the baby outside the body. And that process is accomplished by lactation. Okay. And where does lactation occur? Take place? It takes place in the breast. Okay, so the organ responsible for lactation is the breast. And what is breast actually? It is a modified apocrine gland. Okay? Okay? Right. So, whenever we consider the reproductive system of the female, we are going to discuss something called the female genital tract. Female genital tract. So, the female genital tract is made up of the uterine tubes, okay, what are the other names of the uterine tube? They are also known as what? Right, oviducts. And they are also known as, I just mentioned some time back, the fallopian tubes. Okay. Then uterine tubes. Then you have the uterus. Okay, uterus. So the uterus, it's important to remember at this stage, uterus has got three parts, okay? From outer to inner, there is the perimetrium, okay? And the middle part is the myometrium, and the innermost part would be the endometrium. Okay, so what is the uterus? It is a muscular organ where the ova after fertilization gets implanted. Okay, and the uterus nourishes the growing conceptus and brings it to term. Okay, so the endometrium itself is made up of a compact layer, a spongy layer, and a basal layer. Okay. So why should we remember this? Because the compact layer and the spongy layer is sloughed off during menstruation. Okay, so these layers are sloughed off during menstruation. Okay, so we'll be discussing this point later on. So this is basically setting a stage to what we are going to discuss. So what does the uterus do? It is a site for implantation. Implantation of what? The fertilized ova. Okay. What does it do? It provides an appropriate environment for placental and fetal development. Okay, so it provides an appropriate environment for placental and fetal development. So this placenta, we will be studying that it is a source of a gonadotropin. Which gonadotropin? Yes, human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay, human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay, so that's why we need to remember this, because we are discussing about gonadotropins. Okay, so let's go back to our picture out there. So in addition to LH and FSH, we are also going to discuss the human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay, it is not from the hypothalamo-pituitary-gonadal axis. It is rather produced in the placenta, produced by the placenta, but it has got effects similar to LH. Okay, so therefore it's included under gonadotropins, which we have already discussed in our introductory remarks. Okay, so the female genital tract, here we have seen, it's made up of the uterine tube, it's made up of the uterus, and then there is the cervix. Okay, so let's write somewhere down here. There is also the cervix. Okay, so what is the cervix? The cervix is the lower end of the uterus. Okay, so let's see. Cervix. And then we have got the muscular tube of the, you're right, veg. Okay, so these four make up the female genital tract. Okay, so okay, So what is the female genital tract? The female genital tract is a tract of the reproductive system which is made up of uterine tubes, uterus, cervix and vagina. Okay, vagina. Okay. Summarize what we have learned thus far. We said that there are lots of functions of the female reproductive system, and to enable this function, it has got different organs, and we talked about the female genital tract. So let us summarize what we have learned and write it down here. Okay. So to perform the functions of the female reproductive tract, the female reproductive system has, what does it have? It has one. It has primary sex organs. So which are the primary sex organs? They are the ovaries. And we have two numbers of ovary. Okay? The second organs that the female reproductive systems have, they are called secondary sex organs. And what are the secondary sex organs? They are the fallopian tubes, the uterus, the cervix, there is the vagina, there are external genitalia, okay, external genitalia meaning the labia majora, the labia minora, and then there is the breast. Okay? So these form the secondary sex organs. Now we know what's the function of the breast. It enables lactation. Okay? All right. So that is the summary of what we have discussed some time back. Let us now talk about gametogenesis. Okay. Gametogenesis. Okay. We are talking about gametogenesis in the females of the human species. So here we are going to consider the formation of ova. Yeah. So development begins with fertilization. Okay, where suppose this is the ova, and let's consider this as the sperm, Okay, so the coming together of the male nucleus and the female ova, that is called fertilization. So development begins with fertilization, and fertilization leads to the zygote that is formed. The zygote. Okay, so this zygote divides and in the second week meaning the second week of development, the stem cells, so stem cells are cells that can give rise to different lineages of cells, because like the stem cells can become liver cells, the stem cells can become heart cells, the stem cells can become cells of the GIT, and so on and so forth. So the stem cells give rise to what is called the primordial germ cells. Okay, so primordial germ cells are the cells that will eventually give rise to the secondary oocyte. So these primordial germ cells, they migrate to the walls of the yolk sac. Okay, so if you remember embryology, so that's what's happening. The primordial germ cells migrate to the walls of the yolk sac. By the fourth week of development, these primordial germ cells, the primordial germ cells, let's abbreviate it. Primordial germ cells, the primordial germ cells migrate towards the developing gonads. Okay, so the primordial germ cells, again I got it wrong here. Primordial germ cells migrate towards the developing gonad. Okay, here we are talking about the female gonad, okay? They develop towards the, they migrate towards the developing gonad. So they arrive at the developing gonad by the end of the fifth week. Okay, so they reach the developing gonad at the end of the fifth week. Now, these primordial germ cells undergo mitosis and differentiation to become oogonia. These oogonia, let us represent these by a cell, and let us represent the total chromosomes by 2 chromosomes. Okay. So this oogonium, let's write how many chromosomes it has. It has 46 single chromosomes, and therefore the total DNA is 2n. Okay? Okay. And so let us represent the total 46 chromosomes by a single chromosome. Okay. So let's say this is one chromosome, and this is the second chromosome. So this represents oogonia. Okay. Now, this oogonia has to become a secondary oocyte, meaning it has to become, it has to end up with as 23 single chromosomes, and the DNA content should become 1n. Okay, and that would be the genotype of a secondary oocyte. Okay, so this is the journey that we are going to explain with this diagram. Okay, so this cell gets into meiosis 1, because remember 46 should become 23, so the cell division that enables that is meiosis. Okay, so this oogonia undergoes meiosis. Okay, and what happens in meiosis is this primary oocyte is formed. Okay, so primary oocyte is formed. Okay, so from oogonia, a primary oocyte is formed, and it undergoes meiosis. So what is the event that takes place in meiosis? The event that takes place in meiosis is DNA duplication or DNA duplication, that we call it replication. Okay, so DNA duplication takes place. So let's draw this diagram and try to explain what's happening here. Okay. We've got the first chromosome here that will duplicate, and the second one would duplicate as well. Okay, so what we obtain here is a primary oocyte, and the genotype would be, if this is 46, then that's 2n. This would be 46 duplicated 46 duplicated chromosomes. Okay, so the total nucleic acid content will also double. Okay, so that would be 4n. Okay, so that is the genotype of the primary oocyte. Now, this primary oocyte is dormant in this um, prophase, dormant in prophase of meiosis till puberty. Okay, so the primary oocyte is dormant in prophase of meiosis till puberty. That is, it gets arrested in prophase. Mitosis doesn't continue. Okay, but when the child enters puberty, what would happen is this primary oocyte. Okay, so we are telling this is after puberty. Okay, so after puberty. So after puberty happens, what happens to the primary oocyte? So what happens is, in this cell, the two chromosomes come together. Okay, the chromosomes come together, meaning they near each other. They come to near each other, and this is called synapses. Okay, so after it undergoes synapses, what happens is the next event is, let's draw this diagram again. After synapses, what happens is there is, let's draw this here. Okay, and we have the second chromosome. Okay, so this step is called crossing over. And the structure that is formed here is called the chiasma. Okay, this structure is called the chiasma. Okay, so this enables the chromosomes to exchange genetic information. Okay, so then what happens is that after the chiasma, what happens? The chromosomes, let's draw this chromosome like that, and obviously it has a part of the green, okay, because of, so it has, let's depict it like this. It's got a part of the green, okay, because of crossing over. Now what happens is, this cell splits into two. Okay? Okay, so one cell has got a genotype like this, and the other has got a similar genotype, but it is a smaller cell. Okay, so this smaller cell, it splits into two. This smaller cell is called the first polar body. Okay, but it has got the same genetic makeup, but the cytoplasm is less. So one cell has got massive amounts of cytoplasm, and the other becomes kind of small. So this is called the secondary oocyte. Okay, so the secondary oocyte, and let's write the genotype. The genotype would be, it is 23 duplicated chromosomes. Okay, 23 duplicated chromosomes, and the amount of DNA is still 2n. Okay. Okay, so from 4n we have reached 2n. Okay, so remember what is happening here. One chromosome, when this cell splits, one chromosome goes here and the other goes here. That is why it becomes 2n from 4n. Okay. Then this cell, this secondary oocyte, it undergoes ovulation. Okay. So now what happens? It goes into ovulation. After that, it enters into meiosis 2. Okay. In meiosis 2, it gets arrested at the metaphase. Okay, so this cell that we have here, okay, gets arrested in metaphase. So let's draw this again, the chromosome here. And this is the green part of it. Okay, and it gets arrested, stood in metaphase of meiosis 2, which means meiosis is not completed. Okay. Meiosis 2 is not completed. Okay. Then what happens is fertilization takes place. Okay, so this cell undergoes fertilization. In fertilization, meiosis 2 becomes complete. So the event that happens on fertilization is meiosis 2 gets completed. So if meiosis 2 gets completed, this cell splits into 2. That's the idea. Okay? So this cell now splits into 2. This is the first cell, and again, this is a smaller cell with the same genetic complement. Okay? Okay, so meiosis 2 is now completed. And again, there is halving of the genetic material. So one cell will have a chromosome like this, and the other one will have a chromosome like that. Okay, only one will have the green part to it. Okay, so the daughter cells are kind of different, different genetic makeup. Okay. So this is called the second polar body. Okay, and this is the mature oocyte. Okay, so this mature oocyte, now what will be the genotype? it will be 23 single chromosomes, and it has become half, so it will be 1N. That will be the genotype of the mature oocyte. Okay, so what we are talking about is oogenesis. Okay, so we have talked about what is oogenesis. It is the formation of the mature oocyte. Okay, and the point to remember here is that in the developing fetus, the cells are arrested in the prophase of mitosis 1, and it continues to remain in that arrested state till puberty. The moment puberty hits, the cells undergo maturation, and what is the end point of final maturation is this secondary oocyte, and that again is arrested at the metaphase of meiosis 2, and only on fertilization is meiosis 2 completed. So in that stage, what happens? These secondary oocyte splits into what will become the mature oocyte and the second polar body. So this is what happens in oogenesis. So why are we studying this? Because we are going to put this in context when we see how are hormones responsible for this process. So in summary, we can say there is a primary oocyte, this primary oocyte undergoes division to form a secondary oocyte, and a polar body, okay. This again undergoes division to form the second polar body, this divides to form the mature oocyte. Okay, so this polar body, what happens? This also divides into two double cells. Okay, so these are all polar bodies. So how many polar bodies are formed in total? Yes. Totally 3 polar bodies, and 1 oocyte. Again, this is formed from 1 oogonium. So we've got oogonium. From each oogonium, we get 1 mature oocyte, okay, and 3 polar bodies. So this is what is happening. This mature oocyte is called the ova. Okay. So this mature oocyte is called the ova. The fate of the 3 polar bodies is that they degenerate. Okay, so now the question is, why does the secondary oocyte and the primary oocyte divide asymmetrically, meaning one cell is bigger and one cell is smaller. So you remember that the primary cell, the mature oocyte or the secondary oocyte is bigger than the polar body. The reason is that the increased cytoplasm provides the nutrition to the zygote till it implants in the walls of the uterus. Okay, so that is why the cytoplasm is bigger. It serves as a source of nutrition for the developing zygote. Okay, and that ensures that the zygote has got enough nutrition till it reaches the uterus, okay, where it implants and then gets the further nutrition for it to grow. Okay, so that is the reason why there is formation of the secondary polar bodies. Okay, so in this case, 3 polar bodies are formed from one oogonium. Right? Now let us look at the physiological aspects of the female reproductive system. Physiological aspects of the female reproductive system. Specifically, we will be looking at folliculogenesis, and subsequently we will be looking at the female reproductive cycle. So let's begin with folliculogenesis. Okay, so folliculogenesis is the process of formation of the ovarian follicles. Okay. So follicles themselves, or a follicle, is the basic functional unit of the ovary. Okay, so what's a follicle? A follicle is the basic functional unit of the ovary. Okay, so what does it contain? Let's diagrammatically explain. Okay, so this follicle contains a single oocyte, okay, single oocyte, and granulosa cells enclosed by a basal lamina. Okay, it contains a single oocyte enclosed by, let's draw some cells out here, enclosed by these cells are what we call the granulosa cells. Okay. So it contains an oocyte surrounded by this flattened layer of cells, which we call the granulocyte. Okay, so granulocyte cells. Okay, and there is a clear region which lies between the oocyte and the granulocyte cells, and that clear region is called zona pellucida. Okay, so this clear region is called zona pellucida, and chemically the clear region contains glycoproteins. Okay, so which are mucoid. Okay. So, ovarian follicles. A follicle we have defined is the basic functional unit of the ovary, and it consists of a single oocyte surrounded by granulosa cells or granulocytes. Okay, so let's granulosa cells. Okay, so we'll be using this terminology, okay, granulosa cells. So granulosa cells surrounding the zona pellucida. Okay, so this is a follicle. All right, okay. So let's continue with what we previously described. This oocyte, where does that come from? That oocyte is derived, this oocyte is derived from what? Yes, from the primordial germ cells, which we abbreviated as PGC. Okay. Somehow I always tend to write PGM. It's PGC. Okay, primordial germ cells. Okay, and where are this primordial germ cells? So let's write it here again. Derived from oogonium, which are in turn derived from okay. So the oocytes are derived from oogonium, which in turn are derived from oogonium derived from primordial germ cells. Okay, and that in later on development gets surrounded by the granulosa cells, and then we call this a ovarian follicle. Okay. All right. So at 20 weeks of development, 20 weeks of development, there are approximately 6 to 7 million follicles. Okay. In newborn females, approximately about 400,000 remain. Okay. By puberty, about 90% of 400,000 is lost. Okay, so there is loss of about, let's say 90% gets depleted. So at puberty, how many would remain? There would be about 40,000. Okay, 40,000 remains at puberty. Okay. By the age of about 37 years in a female, there would be further reduction. There would be about 25,000 would remain. Okay, by the time the lady reaches about 50 years, she would have approximately maybe thousands, okay, would remain. Okay, only that much would remain. Of these, during the reproductive life, okay, let's write it down here. During the reproductive life, okay, meaning from puberty to menopause, that's what we call the reproductive life, about 400 follicles would release the secondary oocyte, means 400 follicles will undergo ovulation. Okay, so the process of release of the ova is called, of the secondary oocyte is called ovulation. So during a lifetime of an average female, about 400 follicles ovulate. Okay. So what we have said is, let's divide life like that, and we say this is after puberty. Let's say this is before puberty. Okay. So after puberty, this is the state. We have 400 follicles which would go for ovulation. So what about before puberty? Okay. So before puberty, what happens is these follicles mature. Okay, by maturation we mean they increase in size, and then they undergo and undergo atresia. Okay, so what is atresia? It is basically degeneration. Okay, so follicles mature and undergo atresia. But remember, the primary oocyte is still arrested in prophase of mitosis 1. So that is the reason why there is reduction of this number to this number. 90% gets depleted, because in children these follicles mature and undergo atresia. Okay, so that's the reason why 400,000 becomes 40,000. Okay, so if the question is what happens to those follicles, that is the answer. Okay. So the follicles that are present here, these follicles, okay, let's say the follicles that are present at 20 weeks of development, we call them primordial follicles. Okay, so these primordial follicles are present throughout life, basically. Okay, so when we say primordial follicles, we mean those follicles which were formed and which will continue to remain in the body of the female. They are called primordial follicles. Now, when we said follicles mature and undergo atresia, what we mean is that growing follicles are recruited from primordial follicles. Okay, so growing follicles are recruited from primordial follicles. Okay, so at different stages of life, we can see different types of growing follicles, but all these growing follicles are derived from the primordial follicles. So let's see what are the different types of growing follicles seen in a typical female body throughout her life. Okay, so these growing follicles can be based on their histological characteristics. They can be divided into primary, secondary, tertiary, Graphian, and atretic. Atretic follicles. Okay, so they can be divided as atretic, graphic, tertiary, secondary, and primary follicles. Okay, so these are the different types of follicles. Now, this Graphian follicle is the mature follicle. Okay, this mature follicle releases the secondary oocyte during ovulation. Atretic, we said this is after release of the Graphian follicle. If pregnancy doesn't happen, then that Graphian follicle turns into corpus luteum, and then finally it becomes atretic, or it degenerates. Okay, so that's what we need to remember. So let's look at, let's draw another picture of a typical Graphian follicle. We said it contains the ova, the primary oocyte. So that's the primary oocyte surrounded by granulosa cells. So let's draw some granulosa cells out here. Okay, so this is a diagrammatic representation of a typical follicle. Okay, so this follicle, if it is less than 19 micron, what is the length we are talking about? This length. Okay, if that length is less than 19 micron, then we call it a resting follicle. Okay, so that's a resting follicle that would be present in intrauterine life. It's not undergoing growth. Okay? The average follicle size, a growing follicle size, would have, say, a primary follicle would have it would be about 25 microns in length. Okay? And, oh, this is a growing follicle, I'm sorry. So this is a resting follicle is 19, and a growing follicle this size would be approximately 25 microns. Now, when it reaches about a growing follicle, when it reaches about 60 microns, we call it a primary follicle. Okay, approximately 60 microns. So what is the difference between either a resting or a growing follicle and a primary follicle is the number of layers of the granulosa cells. So in the growing follicle or in the resting follicle, there is only one layer thickness of granulosa cells. So if you see here, this is just one layer. Okay, so when the granulosa becomes multi-layered, we call it a primary follicle. Okay, so that is a primary follicle. So let's draw, maybe it will make things clear. We got a follicle here, and we've got lots of cells. Okay, and now we got more than one layer of granulosa cell. And of course, we have the primary oocyte. Okay, so that would be a primary follicle. Okay, that would be a primary follicle. Okay. Just copy because I will be needing it later. Okay. So that's a primary follicle. Now, this primary follicle develops into the secondary follicle. So let's see what's a secondary follicle. Okay. So that's the primary follicle. If this primary follicle develops another layer of cells, okay, develops another layer of a different type of cells, okay, so these cells are called thecal cells. Okay, theca. Okay, it's theca cells. Okay, theca cells. If it gets surrounded by theca cells, or when we begin to see theca cells, we call it a secondary follicle. Okay, and the size, because another layer has come, definitely the size also increases. So the size now becomes about 120 microns. So the presence of the theca cells makes a primary cell, primary follicle as differentiates the primary follicle from the secondary follicle. Okay. Now let's see what happens when how we obtain the tertiary follicle. Okay. So now we are going to talk about the tertiary follicle. Okay, so when the thecal cells continue to grow, they continue to divide. The thecal cells continue to divide, and maybe like that. They continue to divide. And what you observe here is, let's highlight it here. Here, maybe I'll highlight it with another color. Okay, so that is a cavity. Okay, that's a cavity. Okay, so this cavity is called an antrum. So when the theca cells continue to multiply and they form cavities, the antrum, which gets filled with the fluid. Okay, now this fluid is biochemically rich in estrogen. Okay. And the size becomes around, say, 150 microns. Then we call this a tertiary follicle. The point to remember here is this development is under the influence of FSH and LH. Okay. So there are a couple of reasons why. The thecal cells, let's write it down here. Thecal cells produce steroids. Okay. So these steroids, usually androgens. Okay, let me write down here, androgens. These androgens are taken up by the granulosa cells and then converted to estrogens. Okay, so the steroidogenesis of the thecal cells is stimulated by FSH and LH. Okay, so that is why the growth of the tertiary follicle onwards is under the influence of FSH and LH, which means the coming from the resting follicle to the primary follicle to the secondary follicle, it doesn't need FSH or LH. So they are FSH and LH independent growth. Okay, so that is why they are able to grow like that and then undergo atresia. Okay, and that happens before puberty. Okay, so here, so what happens after puberty is that there is there is release of FSH and LH, and that actually makes the follicles to further develop. All right? Okay. So then we have these follicular cells, the tertiary follicular cells, and now there is also an effect of FSH and LH, which are the gonadotropins. Under the influence, the tertiary follicular cells become a Graafian follicle. Okay, so the size would be about 5,000 micrometer. Okay, so what happens? This Graafian follicle, it gives rise to the secondary oocyte. Okay, during ovulation. Okay, so ovulation. After ovulation, what will happen? Graafian follicle, in the process of ovulation, releases the secondary oocyte. Okay. So then what happens? The follicle bursts open, releases the oocyte, and then the follicle itself then degenerates into a corpus luteum if the pregnancy doesn't occur. It becomes atretic. Okay, if pregnancy happens, then under the influence of human chorionic gonadotropin, which is released from the placenta, the Graafian follicle will be maintained. All right. Okay, so those we'll be visiting those aspects later on. Okay.